The vast, empty concourse of the airport stretched before me, a cathedral of departure and arrival rendered still. Fluorescent light, a sterile, unwavering hum, polished the vacant floors to a sheen, reflecting a distorted, elongated version of myself. Escalators, their metallic teeth locked in perpetual ascent, stood like silent, rusted monuments to journeys that would not be taken. I walked through the echoing quiet, my footsteps the only sound, a stark contrast to the usual cacophony of human movement. This liminal space, stripped of its purpose, felt like a premonition, a pause before an unknown descent. My life, until this inheritance, had been a quiet, measured affair of lines and contours. A cartographer, I found solace in the precise articulation of the Earth's surface, the methodical transformation of chaotic wilderness into ordered grids. My world was one of meticulous detail, of ink on vellum, of mountains tamed by scale bars and rivers confined to blue lines. This quiet existence had, perhaps, ill-prepared me for the sudden, sprawling wildness that now awaited. The journey from the airport was a slow shedding of the familiar. The highway, once a ribbon of asphalt, gradually gave way to narrowing roads, then to a gravel track that seemed to burrow deeper into the land rather than traverse it. The scent of exhaust fumes was replaced by the damp, earthy perfume of pine needles and decaying leaves. Trees, initially distant sentinels, began to crowd the edges of the path, their branches intertwining overhead, forming a perpetual twilight. Sunlight, when it managed to pierce the canopy, fell in fractured, shifting patterns, like something broken trying to mend itself. After what felt like an age, the track finally terminated at a pair of wrought iron gates, rusted to a deep, ruddy brown, half swallowed by a riot of ivy and thorny brambles. The gate, when I finally wrestled it open, groaned a complaint that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath my boots. Beyond lay a driveway, a forgotten vein of cracked flagstones, disappearing into an impenetrable wall of green. It was less a path and more a tunnel, carved by time and neglect, leading into the maw of the forest. I drove slowly, the crunch of my tires on loose gravel a stark intrusion on the profound silence. The air grew heavier, cooler, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and something else, something ancient and vegetal, like moss that had never known the sun. The trees here were different, merely old but gnarled, their trunks twisted into grotesque postures, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. They seemed to watch, not with curiosity, but with a deep-rooted indifference. The forest pressed in, an almost physical weight, blurring the edges of my vision, making the world outside the car windows feel like a dream. Then, through a momentary break in the verdant wall, the house appeared. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, had scaled its walls, embracing it in a stranglehold of green, pulling at the very mortar. It was not merely old, it was consumed. The grandeur that must once have defined it was now merely a ghost, overshadowed by the relentless reclamation of the wild. My gaze swept across the property, a cartographer's instinct to survey, to understand the lay of the land. But here, my professional eye faltered. The way the ground sloped, the unnatural density of certain thickets, the peculiar, almost deliberate pattern of growth in the underbrush. It defied the logical flow of terrain. It felt less like a natural landscape and more like a carefully arranged, albeit wild, deception. The forest wasn't just around the house. It felt like it was part of it, its roots woven into the very foundations, its branches reaching into the empty rooms. This wasn't just an isolated property. It was a place that had been swallowed whole, a quiet, breathing thing unto itself. It was the feeling of being watched, not by an animal, but by something vast and patient, something that had been here long before the house, long before any human foot had disturbed its ancient slumber. The air hummed with an invisible tension, a quiet thrumming beneath the surface of reality. My cartographer's precision, which usually brought order, here only highlighted the profound, unsettling disarray. This land did not merely exist, it brooded. And in that brooding, I sensed a malevolence, a quiet, ancient will that seemed to resent my very presence. My determination, a quiet, stubborn thing, tightened its grip. I had come to map this inheritance, to bring order to its wildness. This was a presence, and it was already charting me. I stood there, a solitary figure dwarfed by the cavernous space, the weight of a past I barely knew settling upon my shoulders. The air, recycled and cold, offered no comfort, only the faint metallic tang of disuse. It was a threshold, I realized, between the world I knew and the one I was about to enter. A silent, stark farewell to the familiar. The drive was a slow unraveling of the known. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to tracks barely distinguishable from the forest floor. The world outside the car windows shed its manicured edges, blurring into an unbroken tapestry of green and gray. Each mile deeper into the forgotten woods felt like a page turning in a very old book, the ink fading, the paper brittle. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primal perfume that clung to the windows and insinuated itself into the car's cabin. Sunlight, once a generous flood, became a fractured mosaic, splintering through the dense canopy in hesitant emerald shards. The house itself was a stoic sentinel. Gray stone swallowed by ivy, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from under heavy brows of slate. It was not grand, but imposing, a testament to time and neglect. My cartographer's eye immediately registered the encroaching forest, its tendrils reaching, testing the boundaries. This, I thought, was where my work would begin. My tools, precise and familiar, offered a small comfort against the sprawling unknown. The compass, the measuring tapes, the meticulously folded gridded paper, these were my anchors in a world threatening to become untethered. The following morning, after a night of unsettling dreams where the house creaked and sighed like a living thing, I began. My intention was systematic, a cartographer's ritual. I started with the immediate perimeter, the neglected gardens that bled into the wild. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and earthy, like old blood in damp soil. My steps were careful, my gaze sweeping the undergrowth, noting contours, elevations, the gnarled architecture of ancient trees. It was on an oak, its bark a deeply furrowed hide that I first saw them. Simple carvings, but symbols, deeply incised, almost gouged into the living wood. They were angular, stark, a series of interconnected lines and sharp points that seemed to writhe even as I traced them with a hesitant finger. My methodical mapping faltered, my pen hovering over the paper. These were not features of the land, but marks upon it. A language I could not decipher yet felt compelled to understand. Further into the northwestern stretch of the property, where the trees grew so dense the canopy formed a perpetual twilight, I stumbled upon another anomaly. It was a well, not the neatly stone-lined kind found in village greens, but a rough, almost brutal circle of jagged, moss-covered stones. I approached cautiously, the hairs on my arms rising. I dropped a small stone, its clatter echoing down, 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 for an unnervingly long time before a faint, distant plink reached my ears. The sound was swallowed almost immediately, as if the well itself had consumed it. This was no ordinary well. It was a throat, an opening into something fathomless. As the day waned, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, the forest began to shift, to watch. The air grew heavy, pressing in on me, and the feeling of being observed intensified, a constant, unseen gaze that seemed to follow my every step. My precise, ordered world, defined by lines and angles, was becoming porous, permeable. The forest was no longer just a landscape. It was a presence, vast and indifferent, yet undeniably aware. And I, Blake, the cartographer, was no longer merely mapping its surface, but charting the unsettling contours of its hidden, hungry soul. My own footsteps, sharp and solitary, echoed through the cavernous space, a stark reminder of the distance I had already traveled and the deeper solitude I was about to embrace. The journey to the ancestral home was a slow dissolution of the world I knew. The asphalt ribbon of the highway eventually frayed into a gravel track, then a barely discernible path swallowed by an ancient, grasping forest. Trees, gnarled and thick with moss, pressed in on either side, their branches interwoven like the fingers of a sleeping giant. The air grew heavy, damp with the scent of decaying leaves and wet earth, a primal perfume that settled deep in my lungs. My vehicle, a utilitarian rental, felt alien and small, an intruder in a realm that seemed to predate human memory. When the house finally emerged from the gloom, it did so with a silent, imposing presence. It was larger than I remembered from the faded photographs, its stone walls a tapestry of lichen and shadow. A heavy, hand-carved oak door, warped by centuries of weather, seemed to sigh as I pushed it open, releasing a breath of stagnant air that tasted of dust and forgotten things. I spent the first few days simply existing, unpacking my meticulous instruments, my rolls of parchment, my specialized pens. The house itself seemed to breathe around me, a symphony of creaks and groans that I attributed to its age, to the settling of ancient timbers. I chose a large, north-facing room on the second floor as my workspace. It offered a sweeping, if obstructed, view of the forest, and its high ceilings gave me ample space for my drafting table. The methodical precision that defined my life, I set up my equipment. My heavy brass compass, its needle always true, my finely calibrated measuring tapes, my array of protractors and rulers. Each tool found its designated place. The smell of freshly unrolled paper, crisp and clean, offered a temporary reprieve from the house's musty embrace. The initial mapping began with the immediate surroundings of the house, plotting the perimeter, the ancient, crumbling walls of what might have once been a garden. One afternoon, after carefully measuring a particularly ancient oak, I returned to my table to record the coordinates. My 30-centimeter steel ruler, which I had left precisely aligned with the edge of a fresh sheet of paper, lay askew, several centimeters to the left. I paused, a faint prickle of unease tracing my spine. Perhaps I had nudged it, I reasoned, distracted by the gnats that swarmed near the window. Later that evening, as twilight bled through the tall windows, painting the room in shades of bruised violet, I was reviewing my preliminary sketches. I had drawn a rough outline of the property's boundary, a simple, unwavering line. My gaze drifted for a moment to the flickering candle, then back to the paper. The line, I was certain, had shifted. A subtle, almost imperceptible bend now marred its precision, a slight convex curve where before there had been none. The isolation was playing tricks on my eyes. I smoothed the paper, ran a finger along the offending curve. It felt real, etched into the fibers. I took a fresh sheet, retraced the boundary, concentrating harder this time. I even marked the page with a small initial, a habit born of a need for absolute verification. The next morning, the sun struggling to assert itself through a sky heavy with cloud, I returned to my work. My eyes went immediately to the fresh sheet, to the boundary line I had drawn with such care. The initial was still there, a small, defiant B in the corner. But the line was undeniably different. The curve was more pronounced, almost a shallow arc, pulling inward toward the center of the sheet as if something were drawing the land itself towards a hidden core. This was not a trick of the light. The needle stilled, then swung with an unnerving deliberateness, settling on a point directly beneath the floorboards. My carefully plotted coordinates, the very bedrock of my profession, began to betray me. A cluster of trees I had mapped yesterday, their positions precise to the millimeter, appeared on my grid this morning with a subtle but definite shift. A stream I had traced, its course unwavering, now seemed to ripple on the page, its banks subtly redefined, as if a quiet current had altered its path overnight. The methodical rhythm of my work, usually a source of calm, became a frantic dance. I redrew, remeasured, re-verified, only to find the discrepancies persist, sometimes even worsen. A floorboard would groan behind me just as I noticed a new distortion on my map. A gust of wind would rattle a window precisely when my hand hesitated over a misaligned line. My sanity, a carefully constructed edifice of logic and order, felt suddenly fragile. They was I succumbing to the isolation? They was this ancestral home, with its ancient forests and decaying grandeur, simply wearing down my mind? I wanted to believe it, clung to the notion like a drowning man to a spar. The land, it seemed, was alive, and it was beginning to redraw my world. Escalators, their metallic teeth locked in an eternal ascent and descent, stood like petrified waterfalls, silent witnesses to an absence. I had sought this place, this gleaming husk of transit, hoping its antiseptic neutrality might cleanse the clinging shadows from my mind, or at least offer a temporary reprieve. But even here, in this monument to human movement, a stillness far deeper than mere abandonment seemed to reside, a quiet that swallowed sound and light alike. My breath, shallow and ragged, plumed faintly in the cool, conditioned air. Each step I took echoed with an unnerving clarity, a lonely percussion against the polished stone. The hum of the lights, once a uniform drone, began to warp, subtly at first, a barely perceptible shift in pitch, like a distant, massive engine struggling to maintain its rhythm. I paused, tilting my head, listening. I pressed on, my determination a brittle shield against the encroaching strangeness. I told myself it was fatigue, the residue of sleepless nights, the relentless grind of my own thoughts twisting perception. The motionless escalators, previously just architectural features, began to draw my eye, their static precision now imbued with a menacing stillness. The metal treads, each one a sharp, angular step, seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, not moving, but threatening too. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a dull throb that resonated with the altered hum of the lights. The sterile scent of the airport, a faint chemical tang, was slowly being overtaken by something else, something ancient and earthy. The smell of damp soil, of deep roots disturbed, of stone that had slept for millennia. It was a scent that had no business in this gleaming, artificial space. Then it came, not as a sound or a sight, but as an overwhelming presence. A sudden, crushing weight that descended upon me, stealing the air from my lungs. It was like plunging into an ocean of ice, but an ice that burned, searing my flesh from the inside out. The hum of the lights intensified to a roar in my ears, yet it was a roar that was utterly silent. A vibration that threatened to shatter the fragile architecture of my skull. I felt myself shrinking, becoming infinitesimally small, a speck of dust against an eternity of hunger. This was not the hunger of a creature of flesh and blood, but a deeper, more fundamental yearning, a craving for existence itself, for the essence of life, for the very fabric of being. Images, not seen with my eyes but imprinted directly onto the canvas of my mind, flickered with terrifying speed. Root systems coiling like slumbering serpents beneath the earth. Vast stretches of forgotten time, the slow, relentless grind of geological ages. It was a consciousness that predated the trees, the hills, perhaps even the land itself. A primordial entity that had simply been observing, waiting, consuming. A wave of nausea, violent and sudden, ripped through me. It was hunger, yes, but also an immense crushing age, a burden of eons that threatened to collapse my own brief existence into nothingness. I felt my energy draining, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a gale. It was searching, probing, tasting. It was touching me, not with hands, but with an unfathomable reach of its awareness, sifting through the layers of my mind, my memories, my very soul. All mine. Then, as abruptly as it had come, the overwhelming pressure receded. The hum of the lights returned to its steady, sterile drone. The reflections on the floor settled, showing only my own pale, trembling face. The smell of damp earth faded, leaving only the faint chemical tang of the airport. My head pounded with a dull, persistent ache. My throat was raw, my mouth dry. I pressed my hands against my eyes, trying to block out the sterile glare, but the images, the feelings, the profound, ancient hunger were burned into my mind. This was no trick of the light, no figment of a weary imagination. This was the entity, and it was not merely a malevolent force in the forest. It was a presence that could reach across miles, across the very fabric of reality, to touch me, to taste me. And I had no doubt at all, that it had found me. The profound cold, a tendril of the recent terror, still coiled within my bones, a phantom limb of dread. My reflection in the polished floor had shown a man on the precipice, and the image haunted me. The crushing weight had lifted, yes, but the memory of it, the possibility of its return, was a new, insidious burden. I needed answers, a map of this unseen threat, even if it meant charting the depths of my own family's forgotten history. The house, with its labyrinthine corridors and dust-shrouded secrets, held the key. I retreated to the library, a room I had barely touched, its shelves groaning under the weight of generations. The air here was thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten lives. Hours bled into one another as I sifted through brittle ledgers, yellowed journals, and volumes bound in decaying leather. My fingers, stained with the fine dust of centuries, traced the faded script of my forebears. The records were maddeningly fragmented, a mosaic of omissions and veiled references. There were entries about the land, always the land, described with an unsettling reverence. The language was archaic, poetic, yet laden with a palpable fear. Or was the protector merely a guise for something far more sinister, its benevolence a slow-acting poison? Directly, not explicitly, but through generations of hushed warnings and unexplained disappearances, they always remember. The use of my own name, a phantom echo across time, made the hairs on my arms prickle. The more I delved, the more isolated I felt, as if the very act of seeking answers was severing my ties to the world beyond these walls. My phone, a useless rectangle of plastic and glass, lay inert. I had tried to call, a fellow cartographer who might understand the peculiarities of old land deeds, but the signal had simply vanished. The internet connection, tenuous at best, had died completely, leaving me with only the dusty ghosts of the past for company. The frustration mounted, a buzzing static in my brain, until a weariness, heavy and profound, claimed me. I must have drifted, for suddenly I was elsewhere. I stood in a vast, empty airport concourse. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unwavering glow on the polished floors. But they illuminated nothing living. Rows of empty seats stretched into the distance, their plastic surfaces gleaming with an unnatural sheen. My footsteps echoed, stark and intrusive, in the cavernous space. No bustling crowds, no hurried announcements, no distant roar of engines taking flight. Only the deep, unnerving quiet. Me, a pair of escalators stood frozen, their metal teeth interlocked, unmoving, leading to a level above that was shrouded in an indistinct haze. They represented ascent, departure, escape, yet they were utterly inert, mocking my desire to leave. I walked towards them, my reflection stretching and distorting on the slick floor, a pale, lost figure in an endless expanse. A profound sense of being stranded, utterly cut off, settled over me. There was no one to ask for directions, no gate to find, no flight to catch. I was trapped in a waiting room for a journey that would never begin. I jolted awake, the lamp still flickering, the scent of old paper clinging to the air. The dream had been too vivid, too real, a perfect mirror of my waking predicament. The outside world had receded, leaving me marooned within these walls, surrounded by the unsettling truths I had unearthed. The entity, whatever it was not merely influencing the house. It was reaching into the very fabric of my perception, twisting my reality, ensuring my isolation. I had sought solace in the familiar, in the precise lines and measured distances of my maps, hoping to chart a course out of the encroaching madness, to impose order upon the chaos that now seemed to breathe within these very walls. My drafting table, usually a sanctuary of logic, felt like a battleground. I had spent hours meticulously rendering the eastern wing, marking every alcove, every forgotten passage. Yet, when I returned with my freshly inked parchment to verify a newly discovered antechamber, the corridor simply wasn't there. My fingers traced the cool, unyielding surface where the door should have been, where my map insisted it was. A tremor, fine as a spider's silk, ran through me. It was not merely forgotten. It was erased, rewritten. The air, which had always carried the scent of damp earth and aging timber, began to shift. Now, a faint metallic tang, like distant rain on hot steel, mingled with the usual must. The house groaned, not with the settling of old wood, but with a deeper, more deliberate resonance. A sound that seemed to emanate from beneath the very foundations. A low, guttural hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I walked, my hand brushing against the textured wallpaper, once a tapestry of faded floral patterns, now feeling rough, almost scaly beneath my touch. As if the very fabric of the house were shedding its skin. It was the only way I knew to fight, to understand. I chose the main hall, a space I thought immutable. Its grand staircase and towering archways fixed points in my mental compass. I measured, sketched, noted the intricate carvings on the banister. Confident in my work, I retreated to the library for a moment's respite, the scent of old paper a fleeting comfort. But when I returned, a mere quarter of an hour later, the main hall had twisted. The grand staircase, once curving gracefully to the left, now ascended sharply to the right, its polished steps leading to a landing that held not the familiar family portraits, but a single, immense, unadorned archway. Beyond it, a pale, almost blinding light pulsed. My heart, which I refused to acknowledge as racing, felt like a trapped bird. This was not senility. This was malice. The house was not merely playing tricks, it was actively warping. I approached the archway, my hand outstretched, a peculiar sensation of static electricity prickling my skin. The light beyond was too bright, too sterile for this ancient place. As I stepped through, the scent of dust and wood vanished, replaced by an artificial ozone crispness, like the air after a lightning strike. I stood on a wide, polished concourse, impossibly vast. Me, a vaulted ceiling of glass and steel stretched into a hazy distance, filtering an anemic, diffuse light. To my left and right, motionless escalators, their metal teeth gleaming, ascended into empty air, their silent, frozen forms monuments to journeys never taken. The concourse was utterly devoid of life, a mausoleum of transit. No distant hum of engines, no murmur of voices, no echo of footsteps. This was not the house. This was not the forest. This was a nightmare rendered in chrome and glass. I turned, desperate to find the archway, the main hall, anything familiar. But behind me, there was only more concourse, stretching endlessly, indistinguishable from the expanse before me. Then, at the far end of the concourse appeared. Small, distant, but undeniably there. Her silhouette was familiar, slender, with a particular tilt to her head. A gasp tore from my throat. She raised a hand, a gesture of beckoning, a silent invitation. I started to run, my boots echoing unnaturally loud on the polished floor. The distance, however, seemed to stretch, remaining perpetually just out of reach, her form shimmering slightly, like heat haze on a summer road. The motionless escalators seemed to lean in, their silent presence more menacing than comforting. I pushed harder, my lungs burning, the image of Alara, my only family, my salvation, driving me forward. But as I drew closer, the details of her form refused to coalesce. And then, as I stumbled, gasping for breath, shifted. The tilt of the head remained, but the shoulders broadened, the silhouette elongating, growing too tall, too gaunt. The beckoning hand elongated, fingers stretching into impossibly thin, spidery digits. The soft, familiar curve of her body dissolved into a jagged, angular form that pulsed with the same anemic light I had first stepped into. It was a mockery, a cruel, exquisite trap. The house, the entity, was not merely twisting the pathways. It was twisting my very heart, using my deepest longings against me. The vast, empty concourse, the silent escalators, the impossible, shimmering figure. They were all threads in a meticulously woven snare. I had retreated from the study, seeking the deceptive comfort of my bed, but sleep had refused its balm. Instead, a peculiar disorientation began to set in, a slow unmooring from the solid lines of the house. The walls of my room seemed to stretch, their familiar patterns blurring into an indistinct gray. The scent of old wood and dust, usually so grounding, thinned into something metallic and sterile. I felt a subtle shift beneath me, not the sway of an old house, but something more vast, an imperceptible glide. When I finally forced my eyes open, the familiar ceiling was gone. Me, a cavernous vaulted expanse of glass and steel stretched into a hazy distance, crisscrossed by skeletal girders. I was standing, not in my bedroom, but on a vast polished floor, reflecting the stark, artificial light that bled from unseen sources. Me, a series of motionless escalators ascended into the gloom, their metal teeth interlocked, frozen in an eternal climb. This was not the forest, not the house. This was a place of transit, yet utterly without movement. The questions felt like pebbles dropped into a bottomless well. My cartographer's mind, always seeking order and orientation, screamed against the impossible geometry of this space. It felt like a map drawn by a madman, boundless yet claustrophobic. The sheer scale was meant for thousands, yet I was utterly alone, my footsteps echoing with an unnerving clarity. My gaze drifted to the vast, empty gates lining the concourse walls. I felt a growing unease, a sense that this place was not merely a dream, but a projection, a construct woven from the fabric of my own thoughts, warped by something else. I began to walk, my boots clicking rhythmically on the unblemished surface. Each step felt heavy, as if I were wading through unseen currents. The motionless escalators loomed, a monument to arrested progress. I remembered the maps, the lines I had drawn, the contours I had traced. They were meant to define, to contain, to understand. But here, in this impossible space, understanding seemed to be the very thing that was being twisted. It spoke of hunger, of slow assimilation. It wasn't a voice, but a feeling, a deep, resonant emptiness that mirrored the vast concourse around me. I saw it then, in the shimmering distortions on the polished floor, in the way the artificial light seemed to drain the color from everything. The land, the house, my own mind. They were not separate entities. They were all part of a single colossal meal. The entity wasn't merely influencing the land, it was the land. Or rather, a consciousness that had entwined itself with it, a parasitic root system feeding on its inherent vitality. And my maps, my attempts to chart its boundaries, to understand its terrain, were not acts of objective observation. Each line I drew, each contour I defined, was a vein opened, a pathway for its influence to seep deeper. It wasn't just consuming the energy of the earth, it was consuming the comprehension of it. It fed on the very act of mapping, the mental effort to delineate, to bring order to its chaos. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow stealing the air from my lungs. My cartography, the very essence of my being, was not a shield against the unknown, but a conduit for it. I was not an observer. I was an unwitting participant in its slow, methodical feast. Every detail I meticulously recorded, every topographical nuance I brought into focus, was not clarifying the world, but rather clarifying me to it. It was absorbing my perception, my understanding, my very sanity as fuel. The concourse suddenly felt smaller, the towering ceiling pressing down. The polished floor seemed to ripple, the reflections twisting into grotesque parodies of my own face, stretched and distorted. The motionless escalators, once merely unsettling, now seemed to beckon with a silent, terrible promise. An ascent into oblivion, a descent into absorption. My determination, which had felt so solid, now fractured under the weight of this new, horrifying knowledge. I was not just mapping a property, I was mapping my own demise. And the entity was guiding my hand, subtly, insidiously, toward the ultimate absorption. I was trapped within my own mind, within a landscape that was both real and horrifyingly conceptual, a map of my own unraveling. Yet, a fragile, desperate resolve had begun to form, a brittle spine against the encroaching dissolution. I would not simply succumb. My efforts to map the property, once a meticulous act of precision, had devolved into a frantic scrawl, lines bleeding into one another, contours shifting with an unseen malevolence. The ink on the parchment seemed to writhe, the very paper groaning under the phantom weight of the land's ancient burden. The compass needle spun wildly, divorced from magnetic north, dancing to some infernal rhythm. The air in the study, usually still and heavy with the scent of old paper and dust, grew thin, tasting of ozone and something metallic, like distant thunder. Then, the world around me began to fray. The edges of my vision shimmered, the familiar oak paneling of the study blurring into indistinct smears of brown. A low hum, not of the house, but of something vast and empty, vibrated in my teeth. I stood alone in an immense cavernous space, bathed in the sickly amber of unseen lights. Me, a vaulted ceiling stretched into a hazy expanse, crisscrossed by skeletal girders. The air was frigid, carrying the faint metallic tang of stale air conditioning and a pervasive chemical cleanliness. Me, an endless ribbon of motionless escalators ascended into the gloom, their metal teeth locked in a silent, permanent ascent, a stairway to nowhere. Each step was a frozen ripple in a metallic river, reflecting the distant, pallid light in 1,000 fractured gleams. Only the faint, almost imperceptible hum that had followed me here, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of this desolate place. This was an airport concourse I knew, but one abandoned, forsaken, caught in a perpetual twilight. The sheer scale of the place, so utterly devoid of life, pressed down on me, a physical weight on my chest. It was the antithesis of the living, breathing forest, yet it felt equally, if not more, dead. I walked, my footsteps echoing with startling clarity, each sound swallowed almost immediately by the immense space. My gaze drifted to the motionless escalators, their frozen ascent a cruel mockery of progress. What destination lay at their summit? The entity was here, I felt it, not as a presence, but as the very essence of this desolation, a vast hunger that had consumed all movement, all purpose, leaving behind only the husk of what once was. A sudden sharp pain lanced through my skull, a brutal snap that pulled me back. My hand was clenched around the leg of my drafting table, knuckles white, the wood splintering beneath my grip. I gasped, drawing in lungfuls of the house's musty air, my body trembling. The hallucination had been so vivid, so utterly real. Shaken but more determined than ever, I ran a hand over the scarred surface of the drafting table, my fingers tracing a faint, almost invisible seam in the wood. It was an old piece, ancestral, like so much else in this house. My grandfather had used it, and his father before him. And before them, perhaps, the first of my line to settle here. My fingers pressed, then twisted, a long-forgotten mechanism clicking softly. A narrow drawer, almost a sliver, slid out from beneath the tabletop, revealing not maps, but a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth, its pages brittle with age. The script inside was precise, elegant, yet increasingly frantic as the entries progressed. It belonged to an ancestor named Alistair, dated almost 2 centuries prior. He too had been a cartographer, drawn to the land's secrets. Of wind, but of something vast, stretching beneath the very roots of the world. My mappings, once an act of clarification, now feel like a ritual, an unwitting invitation. He spoke of the land's nodes of stillness, places where the entity's influence was most profound, where the very air grew heavy and time seemed to snag. I sought to seal it. One entry read, the words a desperate scrawl, to cage the emptiness within its chosen bounds. It mirrored my lines, twisted my intentions. My protective wards became conduits, my boundaries, invitations. It fed on my struggle, on the very act of my resistance. To starve it, one must sever its connections, not merely contain its reach. My breath hitched. Alistair had tried to build a cage. The entity had turned it into a feeding trough. But what if the approach was reversed? What if, instead of drawing lines around it, I could draw lines that broke its hold? The thought was a precarious spark in the encroaching gloom, a desperate gamble. I possessed knowledge Alistair had not, a more precise understanding of the land's topography, its subtle currents, its hidden arteries. My maps, however warped by the entity's influence, still contained the skeletal truth of the terrain. My fingers traced the faded words, a tremor running through me. I looked at my chaotic maps, at the intricate shifting lines. Alistair's failed attempt had provided a crucial, terrible insight. I would not repeat his mistake. I would use the land itself, its contours, its ancient memory, not to contain, but to dismantle. It was my only hope. And it would begin at the heart of the stillness. The air thickened, a viscous syrup clinging to my lungs as I stepped further into the deepest part of the forest. The ancient well, I reasoned, was the heart, the pulsing core of this malevolence. Its cold, dark mouth had always felt like an origin point, a source. I clutched the rolled parchment in my hand, a map unlike any I had ever conceived, not of terrain, but of influence, of pressure points, of the insidious spread of the entity's dominion. My breath, shallow and ragged, plumed white in the frigid air, a fleeting testament to my presence in this suffocating quiet. My boots crunched on the fallen leaves, each sound a stark intrusion in the profound stillness. The trees here were older, their bark gnarled like arthritic knuckles, their branches interwoven into a canopy so dense it swallowed the sky whole, leaving only a sliver of bruised twilight. There was no birdsong, no rustle of unseen creatures, only the rasp of my own jacket, the frantic beat of my pulse against my ribs. A desperate, precarious spark, I had called my plan. It was older than the house, older than any recorded deed, a relic of a time when the lines between earth and spirit were perhaps not so clearly drawn. A faint, earthy scent, cloying and damp, emanated from its depths, mingling with the metallic tang of something almost electrical in the air. Carefully, I unrolled the parchment. It wasn't a map of paths or contours, but a web of lines, symbols, and sigils I had painstakingly derived from the entity's own twisted patterns. From the anomalies in my previous surveys, it was a counter-map designed to disrupt, to fracture. I was drawing lines, not around it, but through it, hoping to sever its sinews. As the last stone settled, a profound shudder ran through the ground beneath me, a tremor that was less geological and more visceral, as if the very earth itself recoiled. The air around the well began to shimmer, a distortion that pulled at the edges of my vision. The gnarled trees, the damp leaves, the rough stone of the well, they all began to dissolve, to melt and reform like wax. The earthy smell vanished, replaced by the sterile, recycled tang of filtered air. The rustling leaves became the faint, almost imperceptible hum of unseen machinery. I was no longer kneeling in the forest. I stood, or rather, felt myself standing, on a polished gray tile floor. Me stretched an empty airport concourse, immense and echoing. The escalators, twin ribbons of motionless metal, ascended silently towards a distant, unreachable upper level, their teeth frozen in a perpetual, useless climb. To seek order where none exists. To believe your lines can contain the boundless. My breath hitched. It had pulled me into a landscape of my own anxieties. The vast, sterile emptiness mocked my reclusiveness. The motionless escalators a cruel mirror of my own stagnant life. My fear of never moving forward, of being trapped. "You are alone," another voice, closer now, hissed, "as you have always chosen to be. Your maps, your solitude, a cage of your own making." I tried to focus, to ground myself. The well, the forest, they were real. I closed my eyes, picturing the bark of the old oak, the moss on the stones. But when I opened them, the concourse remained, stretching into a hazy, indistinguishable distance. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the polished floor. "Aesthesis," a voice rasped, closer still, right beside my ear. "The very perception you trust, I twist. What is real, Blake, if I can show you anything?" My hands clenched into fists, the ghost of parchment still felt within my grasp. I needed to fight this, not by physical force, but by assertion of my own reality. I forced my eyes to sweep the concourse, searching for an anomaly, a seam where its illusion might unravel. The polished floor, the steel girders, the glass walls, all too perfect, too clean. "You are lost," the chorus of voices swelled, rising to a disorienting hum. "A blank space on your own charts." I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to shut out the assault, but the voices resonated within my skull. The concourse began to undulate, its vast spaces stretching and contracting, the motionless escalators appearing to crawl towards me, then recede. My stomach churned, a profound disorientation seizing me. It wasn't just my sight, but my very sense of balance, of spatial awareness that was under attack. The entity wasn't just showing me a place. It was trying to dismantle the very architecture of my mind. My plan wasn't about physical strength, but about definition, about drawing boundaries where the entity sought only formlessness. If it could twist my perception, perhaps I could twist it back. I gripped my phantom map tighter, my gaze sweeping the impossible concourse, searching for the edges of its illusion, a way to reimpose my own design. I was a cartographer, and even this terrifying manufactured space had an architecture. I just had to find its flaws. The concourse pulsed, a living membrane stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Its vastness, moments ago an oppressive void, now compressed, then distended, as if the very air exhaled and inhaled around me. The motionless escalators, once silent witnesses, began to writhe, their metal teeth gnashing in a soundless snarl, their rigid steps seeming to ripple towards me like a predatory current, then recede into an impossible distance. My stomach knotted, a profound disorientation that was more than just physical. It was an unraveling of the self. This was a cage forged from my own fractured perception, a phantom space conjured by the ancient thing that clung to my ancestral land. It sought to drown me in chaos, to sever the tether between my mind and the world I knew. A faint scent, like damp earth and something acrid, a metallic tang, began to prickle the air, cutting through the sterile, stale breath of the phantom airport. It was the smell of the forest floor after a storm, but corrupted, infused with an unseen predatory hunger. This was its triumph, its attempt to consume my very essence, to make me forget the boundaries, the cardinal points, the ordered grid of existence I held so dear. A sudden, sharp clarity pierced through the haze. The entity fed on the unmapped, the undefined. It thrived in the spaces between, in the liminal zones where reality blurred. My maps, my precise lines and meticulous annotations were not just records. They were acts of defiance, impositions of order upon its ancient, formless chaos. It hated me for daring to draw lines across its domain. You map your own undoing. I opened my eyes, the concourse still heaving, but a flicker of resolve ignited within me. If my maps were my cage, they were also my weapon. The entity had dragged me into this psychic arena, but it had underestimated the cartographer's stubborn refusal to be lost. I began to mentally sketch, to impose geometry on the madness. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that nevertheless vibrated through my bones. The voices intensified, morphing into a cacophony of accusations. Fraud. Desecrator. Images flashed before my eyes. My father's disappointed gaze, the crumbling facade of the ancestral home, the intricate, sprawling map of the property I had spent months perfecting, now burning. Its edges curling into black ash. It was trying to break my focus, to pull me back into the emotional quicksand of regret and fear. My mind became a compass, my will a steady hand drawing an unwavering line. I mentally projected the house, my house, onto the undulating concourse. The great hall, the library, my study, the very room where my maps lay. I saw them as points on a mental grid, fixed, immutable. The entity could warp the space around me, but it could not erase the idea of a boundary, the concept of a place. The entity wasn't just influencing the land, it was the land, or rather, the primal malevolent spirit of it, a consciousness that had been stirred by my intrusion, by my audacious attempt to define it, to own it with lines on paper. My grand map, the one that detailed every ancient tree, every hidden spring, every rise and fall of the forest floor, every forgotten cairn. That map was not just a record. I had, in my meticulousness, created a perfect lens through which it could focus its malevolence, a detailed blueprint of my own vulnerability. To truly repel it, to sever its most potent connection, I had to destroy the conduit. I had to unmake my life's work. The thought was a physical blow, a rending of my very soul. To abandon cartography was one thing. To destroy the culmination of my passion, the very thing that defined me, felt like self-immolation. But the alternative was dissolution, an eternal, formless existence within this psychic prison. A gasp, a sound that felt torn from the depths of my lungs. I made my choice. My hands, still pressed against my temples, now became instruments of a different will. I pictured the map, spread out on my desk in the study. I saw its intricate ink lines, its delicate washes of color, its precise scale. And then, with a fierce, burning resolve, I pictured it tearing. A guttural roar, not from the entity, but from the very fabric of the concourse, erupted around me. The vast space contorted violently, the ceiling buckling, the walls collapsing inwards. The motionless escalators shuddered, their metal steps twisting into jagged claws. The voices screamed, a singular, piercing agony, as if I had torn out a piece of their own being. The sterile gleam of the concourse exploded into a kaleidoscope of splinters, each shard a fragment of my own breaking mind. I felt myself falling, not through air, but through layers of perception, a dizzying descent from the mental prison back towards the tangible world. The acrid smell intensified, mixed with the sharp scent of ozone and something akin to burnt paper. My eyes snapped open, blinking against the sudden dim reality of my study. Dust motes danced in the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. On my desk, scattered across the polished surface, lay the tattered remnants of my grand map. It was not burned, but ripped, torn into dozens of jagged pieces, as if by a furious, unseen hand. The intricate lines, the carefully charted details were no more. My magnum opus, the map that had drawn the entity's gaze, was destroyed. The air in the room was thick with a residual tremor, a faint, lingering hum of malevolence. But the crushing weight of the psychic assault had receded. I was a cartographer who had unmade his own world, and in doing so, had perhaps, for a fleeting moment, unmade a piece of the entity itself. The battle was over for now, but the sacrifice had left a chasm in my soul, and the house, my ancestral home, still breathed around me, holding its ancient, terrible secrets close. The vast concourse stretched before me, an endless, desolate expanse of polished floor and silent, skeletal escalators. Their motionless teeth gleamed under a pallid, unblinking light, like the fossilized grin of some colossal, forgotten beast. My breath, a shallow flutter, was the only sound in this impossible arena, a testament to the fragile hold I still maintained. The entity had sought to unravel me here, to scatter my thoughts like dust motes in its chaotic winds, to consume the very framework of my perception. It had given me a space, a canvas, however warped, and I was a cartographer. I closed my eyes, not to retreat, but to see more clearly. The concourse shifted, its lines wavering, threatening to dissolve into a formless void. I saw not the sterile, empty space, but the invisible currents of the entity's influence, the pathways it carved, the nodes of its power. I began to map it, not with ink and parchment, but with the sheer force of my will, etching boundaries onto the fabric of this psychic realm. Each flickering fluorescent tube, each unmoving step of the escalator became a point, a coordinate. I drew lines, not to connect, but to sever, to isolate. It pushed back, a silent, crushing pressure that threatened to buckle my knees, to splinter the very bones of my understanding. I saw the entity not as an omnipresent miasma, but as a specific, terrible presence, rooted to a specific, terrible place. And I drew a cage around it, a cartographic prison, dimension by dimension, line by line. The air grew heavy, thick with a metallic scent, like old blood and ozone. The silent escalators seemed to groan, their metal protesting the invisible forces at play. Then, with a shudder that vibrated through my very marrow, the concourse began to dissolve. The pale lights flickered, the polished floor warped into a rippling pool, and the skeletal escalators buckled, twisting into grotesque, abstract forms. I opened my eyes to a world that felt both familiar and utterly alien. The air, heavy with the damp scent of ancient earth and decaying leaves, clung to my skin like a shroud. Trees stood at unnatural angles, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers, their leaves tinged with a sickly yellow, even in the heart of summer. The earth itself seemed to have exhaled, leaving fissures in the soil like old scars running across the path and into the deeper woods. The house loomed, a gaunt sentinel against the bruised sky. A section of the roof had collapsed inward, a gaping maw and ivy, once merely ornamental, now snaked with a possessive, almost predatory grip across the stone, as if trying to bind the structure to the very ground. The battle had left its mark, a profound trauma etched into the landscape, a physical manifestation of the containment I had imposed. My own body felt like a vessel barely holding together. My limbs moved with a leaden reluctance. My skin felt thin, stretched taut over weary bones. My perception, once so precise, now felt like a frayed rope, threatening to snap at any moment. I had survived, but the reclusive cartographer who had arrived here was gone, replaced by a ghost of himself, forever marked by the unseen. I walked towards the house, each step a deliberate act of will. The entity was not gone. The vastness of its malevolence, its ancient, unthinking hunger was still there, a quiescent beast beneath the scarred earth, within the fractured walls of the house. I had not destroyed it. I had merely drawn a boundary, a map of its prison. It was the understanding that some evils are not vanquished, but merely restrained, their presence a perpetual, silent pressure against the thin veil of our reality. They wait, patient and eternal, for the opportunity to stir once more. I did not enter the house. My steps were slow, deliberate, each one carrying me further from the immediate danger, but deeper into a solitude that would now forever be haunted by the knowledge of what lay beneath, contained but never truly gone.